Hello and welcome back, everyone. And this video is going to be about The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, the book that was published this year, 2024, by Penguin Press. You might recall, or you may not, you might be new to this channel. I already have discussed another book by Jonathan Haidt, that book about the psychology of moral judgment and moral decision making. What is that book called? It's called The Divided something. No, The Righteous Mind. Not Divided. The Righteous Mind. I have a brief discussion of that book also. And I think it is an important book. It's thought-provoking, I think influential for good reasons. But I also had criticisms of that book having to do with, one, the psychologization of the domain of morality, moral judgment. The psychology can, overreach and try to do too much in a domain that is not exclusively its domain. So that's one thing. And psychologists very easily make this mistake. The second thing was that I still think that without really knowing, because of the factor analytic treatment of the topic, what Haidt ended up doing was he looked at the liberal mindset, the liberal approach to morality, through the perspective of the conservative mindset. And it was a natural consequence of having 4 or 5, a number of factors, a number of sensibilities, foundational moral values. And if we say that all of them are operating in the conservative mindset, and some of them are operating in the liberal mindset, we are, without really wanting to say, we are saying that the liberal approach to morality is an incomplete, imperfect version of the conservative. And we end up, without really intending, or maybe intending, while intending tacitly, we end up siding a little bit more with the conservative side, just because the factors are all more active. But that's just a consequence of establishing or aligning those factors with one of them, one of those two positions. And then the other one ends up being a byproduct, it being treated as a byproduct, and seeing how it deviates from the conservative. Liberalism becomes a deviation from that default conservative position. Anyway, so all that is to say, I had a bit of resistance towards reading this book, but I'm glad I did read it, because I think it's, for what it intends to do, it's doing a good job. But I still think that a book like this, a book like The Anxious Generation, should be read alongside a couple of other books in order to maybe moderate its alarming tone and how it is telling us about a very new disaster or culture deteriorating because of, did I say that right? Deteriorating. Culture is in a new way, in a fundamentally new way, it is, or childhood development is being ruined in a way that is completely new, or that I'm telling you what childhood is about. There's a danger if you get one book and that becomes your main book in thinking about a topic, especially when there's a very strong, alarming attitude that the author is warning us about something that is very scary. So I think that could be a little bit moderated if you're aware of, if you have read, for example, other books like that well-known book by Neil Postman, still very much worth reading, Amusing Ourselves to Death. And if you read that book, I would encourage you to read that book and compare the tone and style of Neil Postman with the tone and style of Jonathan Haidt. How much Neil Postman is doing at that time. Was it 1985? Around that time. How much he is doing in that book. And in comparison, what Jonathan Haidt is doing in this book. And his rhetorical devices and how he tries to persuade, how much he relies on images and simple, cartoonish metaphors and analogies, and living on Mars. We are living on Mars if you're using our phone. So Neil Postman is one. Other books about childhood development that I find helpful, one of them is Hold On to Your Kids. Also, I've also discussed that on this channel. Hold On to Your Kids by Gabor Mate and Gordon Neufeld. I will talk about a few other books as we go on, as I get into the discussion of this book. Another general note about books. There are some books that lend themselves easily to conceptual simplification. You can say that a particular book, at the heart of this book, there is a conceptual opposition between this concept and this other concept. And that can help us organize our thinking, and maybe you can even summarize the book. One way of summarizing it would be in terms of these two, the conceptual duality. And with Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, there's a big opposition that organizes the book. And that big opposition is between two types of childhood: the play-based childhood on the one hand, childhood that is based on play, that has room for play, and on the other hand, phone-based childhood. One of those two is declining. The childhood that is based on play is declining, play-based childhood. The other one is on the rise of phone-based childhood, the decline of the play-based childhood. I'll talk more about the play. Play is something that became very prominent in my reading of this book. So Jonathan Haidt talks about this opposition, the rise, decline, of the decline of the good thing, the rise of the bad thing, and he explores some solutions, and he even offers some solutions which I will get to later in the video. And I just want to point out that some of those solutions are at the level of individual decisions and individual families. Some of them are social reforms and social decision, collective action. And it requires cooperation. It requires us to think about our lives as lives of collectives and lives of a society, lives within a society. Okay, the full title of the book, which I think is a helpful thing to read, is The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. So there's a lot packed, a lot of signals about what the book is about, the position of the author. So there's a great rewiring of childhood. And the sources of that rewiring are two things, twofold, as academics like to say. The sources are twofold. One of the two sources is the parenting style, a parenting style that is overly concerned with safety, with which Haidt refers to labels as safetyism. So parenting style, safetyism. And another source is the smartphone use, digital devices, and digital social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and all the rest. And Jonathan Haidt says that kids are overprotected in the real world, in the physical world, in the physical space-time, and they're underprotected in the virtual online world. So imagine the case, one of the examples that Haidt describes in the book, very memorable example of a teenage girl who is looking at a pornography website without the parent knowing, and the parent is at the same time arranging 4 different vegetables, making sure that the child is going to eat enough vegetable with their meal. So that being overprotected, over concern over the number of colors of our vegetables in the meal for the child. And on the other side, there's this neglect of what is happening in the virtual world with the devices that are available to the child. Together, these two sources safetyism, overprotection, and smartphone use and digital media. They have the effect of removing some really essential, necessary real life experience, necessary for healthy development. That's why Haidt talks about smartphones or digital media as experience blockers, because they block experiences that a child needs for development and both mental capacities and physical capacities, like capacity for movement and coordination both with other people and with objects, physical environment. It says that these two are cutting our children's ties, their ties from the physical world, as if, so much so that it's as if the kids are growing up on a different planet, like Mars. This theme of growing up on a different planet and losing touch with the Earth, not being on Earth anymore, not being subject to the laws of the natural laws of the Earth, is something that is also discussed by Byung-Chul in some of his works, including his book on the digital media. This is Digital Prospect, is a subtitle of this book, In the Swarm. This is a short book containing about 20 essays, 16 essays. And one of the essays is called The Nomos of the Earth, which is a phrase, a concept borrowed from Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt talks about the Nomos of the Earth in terms of national sovereignty and international law, ground for international law. But Byung-Chul takes that concept and looks at it at a smaller scale of the moment-to-moment perception and action for an individual, being in touch with the laws or the principles that govern life on Earth versus the principles that are out of touch or different, a virtual world or a virtual domain that seems as if, makes us feel as if we are no longer subject to the Earth. We're no longer creatures that need to live according to the Nomos of the Earth. So Byung-Chul writes, the digital turn means that we are leaving the Earth for good, the terrestrial order. We are not ordered anymore by the terrestrial laws, Nomos. But will this free us from the gravity and the incalculability of the Earth? Calculation, incalculability, that's another topic. To really get that, you need to read this book. To put it briefly, calculation has to do with information. With information, you can calculate. You can do things with information that you can't really do with other kinds of experiences. It's beyond calculation. So let's keep reading. Won't digital weightlessness and fluidity plunge us into free fall? So feeling as if we are out of touch with the Earth, is that something that would come back to haunt us, to bite us? He later writes, the terrestrial order comprises walls, borders, fortresses, stable characters, or a stable character, which flexible Homo digitalis lacks altogether, also belongs to the terrestrial order. The digital medium equals the sea where firm lines cannot be engraved. Firm lines and firm consequences. So this was Byung-Chul, 7 years prior to The Anxious Generation. On the topic of Byung-Chul, there's another book recently published, written by Stephen Knepper, Ethan Stoneman, and Robert Wiley. It's an introduction, an overall introduction to Byung-Chul. It's part of the Key Contemporary Thinkers, published by Polity. This is Byung-Chul, critical introduction. And in this book, if you take a look at the table of content, there are 2 chapters that are explicitly about digital media, chapter 3 and chapter 4. 3 is called Digital Bias, the Positivity of the Transparency Society. Chapter 4 is Digital Psychopolitics, Towards the Total Control Society. I would also recommend this book. Steve Nepper is a professor who I've interviewed already on my YouTube channel. He's a great guy. Anyways, where was I? This leaving Earth and growing up on Mars is something that other people have also discussed, some of them before Jonathan Haidt. So I said that play is a big topic in this book, loss of play, a loss of play-based childhood. You might ask, what are the reasons? Why is play good? Shouldn't kids learn discipline? Can they just learn discipline and live within strict structures? And later, when they are adults, when they have control, when they can choose, then they can play? No. The kind of play that Jonathan Haidt is writing about is part of normal child development. It's a normal activity that has consequence in shaping the psyche of the growing human child. There's a part in chapter 2 where Haidt is talking about how there's a key feature in children's games which is really important, and that is not needing a clear endpoint. Not needing a clear endpoint, just as a way of structuring time. So we read, quote, "Girls especially come to delight in singing songs together, jumping rope together, or playing rhyming and clapping games such as pat a cake, in which high-speed hand motions are perfectly matched between the partners while high-speed nonsense songs are sung at the same time. Such games have no explicit goal or way to win. They are pleasurable because they use the ancient power of synchrony to create communion between unrelated people," end quote. As I said, that's from chapter 2. Synchrony is really huge. Researchers who have investigated child-parent attachment and attachment even between friends and friendly conversations, they have found out that synchrony plays a role. Even synchronous breathing, but synchronous gestures, synchronous body language, and that corresponds to neurophysiological states and activities that are synchronized between people who are sharing an activity together. And that's something that maybe needs to be acquired early in life. Later in the book, Haidt also talks about rules. How, for example, in video games, unlike earthly games that children play, in video games, the rules are fixed and they are set there within the platform, and all kids need to do or should do, supposed to do, is to play according to those rules. They don't do anything with the rules. So this quote says, quote, "As Peter Gray and other play researchers point out, one of the most beneficial parts of free play is that kids must act as legislators who jointly make up the rules, and as judges and juries who jointly decide what to do when rules appear to be violated. In most multiplayer video games, all of that is done by the platform. Unlike free play in the real world, most video games give no practice in the skills of self-governance and governance in general. Online social media platforms like Instagram, the old Twitter and X now, Facebook, they are also designed like games, and they are games of status, games of prestige, or games of influence, or at least apparent influence. Why apparent influence? Why being an influencer doesn't necessarily mean influence? Because there are things like audience capture. The person who is posting, playing the role of the influencer, is doing so because of the reaction of the audience. So for example, imagine if I were to post videos about books talking about 3 takeaways, 3 key insights from the anxious generation, instead of talking more freely and talking in a structured but still somewhat playful way about books, which is the way I like to do them. I like to do these discussions in a playful, open-ended way. But imagine if I were to fall into that trap of responding to what would be popular. 10 key insights from the anxious generation. If I do that, I might have a bigger chance of becoming a YouTube influencer, seeming like my influence is rising, but what is actually happening is audience capture. I'm giving in, I'm submitting to the algorithm, to what people tend to watch, and so on. So this can be, of course, a criticism of digital media, but it can be a deeper critique of culture, the culture of work, the corporate culture, which is why I like James Carse and his wonderful book, Finite and Infinite Games. He talks about the infinite game or infinite games as a type of game that is neglected, a type of game that is not concerned with winning and losing and excluding and showing your mastery, showing your influence. It's a human activity that at least we should recognize that it's possible to engage in the infinite game. Anyways, James Carse also would recommend that book, but let's not get into that now. My own book, which is about experimental psychology or psychological research more generally, is also a similar critique of performance-based or rule-based activity, just like Jonathan Haidt is describing the structure or the limitations of online behavior within online games and social media platforms. A similar thing happens in the culture of science. Scientific research is also, research communities are also rule-based. They are also prone to becoming status games, games of influence, games of prestige. And it's also possible to give into dominant structures and perform according to the rules that give you status. And I closely look at that, especially in experimental psychology, and arguing that that involves neglecting two things at the same time, neglecting the agency of the researcher admitting that there are different ways of doing something or different ways of interpreting something, and at the same time neglecting that the subject that is under investigation, the person who is being studied as the topic of psychology, their agency is also being denied at the same time. Anyway, so this was my point, was just that this critique of rule-based performance, which is anti-play, the spirit of exploration, can go deeper than just social media platforms or online video games. I should mention 4 fundamental problems that result from the combination of safetyism and the predominance of smartphone use, the parenting style and the capture of children's consciousness of kids by smartphone. 4 negative outcomes. One of them is social deprivation, relatively obvious. You don't get to spend much time with others in the shared physical space. The second one is sleep deprivation, which is a consequence of how these smartphones and the applications on them are designed to always interrupt our attention and grab out of nowhere, always grab and attract and capture our attention, which among other consequences can result in sleep deprivation, because your sleep can become a little bit shallow, and that shallow sleep might be enough for you to wake up and check your phone. And there's also the third consequence is fragmented attention. That's also by design, because the homo digitalis, as Byung-Chul says, the contemporary subject using these platforms, using digital media, they should always be available for another notification, another very small fragment of exposure to something that is very catchy, but very soon is followed by the next catchy thing. That sense of continuity in in our lives and in our consciousness is taken away and is replaced by fragmented attention that can be constantly interrupted by the next thing. And finally, fourth, addiction. Now you might say addiction happens in adults. Why Jonathan Haidt is paying attention to childhood addiction as a particular special thing, it's because he points out that the frontal cortex is not developed until mid-20s. The frontal cortex is supporting our self-control, our capacity for delaying our gratification, and our capacity to resist temptation, something that only gives us short-term pleasure. At the same time, our reward-seeking parts of the brain, the reward-seeking neural networks, are mature earlier, which means kids, minors, are more vulnerable, significantly more vulnerable to addictive platforms. Another reason why we should be mindful of kids, teenagers, thinking according to the nomos of the digital media, according to the laws of the digital media, is because they tend to be more doubtful about their status, about where they stand among their peers. They tend to be more sensitive, more preoccupied. And these digital media, these online social media or anti-social media, they capture that sensitivity and utilize it to intensify dependence and addiction. So kids end up having to, they feel the pressure of having to develop an online brand to look good and having to think strategically about the consequence of every post that they send on a social media platform. And this is the opposite of play. It's work, it's performance, and it is outcome oriented. And it is associated with, as Haidt points out, rise of mental health problems, anxiety, depression, self-harm in adolescence. Haidt also talks about something that I'm not going to get into much, and that is sociogenic mental disorders. Essentially, the contagion of mental disorders through social networks, and that can happen online. So depression and other disorders can be transmitted online through social media networks. Something else that is interesting about this book is how the play-based versus phone-based childhood, how that essential dichotomy at the core of the argument, how that is recasted, reformulated in terms of other dichotomies to make it more clear, to make its consequences, implications more clear, yeah. So one of those dichotomies that is play-based versus phone-based is mapped onto is the dichotomy of risk-taking and safetyism. Another one is experience versus information. It's really crucial to know the difference between experience and information. Information is not formative in the same way that rich embodied experience is formative. It teaches us. Experience teaches us in a different way because it involves us more fully. Information is always it seems far from us. It is there at a distance, entertaining us. Another thing that I would add is negativity, positivity, which is Byung-Chul is big on this dichotomy of negative and positive. Phone-based childhood is essentially based on positivity, lots of stuff, lots of entertainment, and not allowing things like boredom, silence, awkwardness. Another dichotomy is the dichotomy between discovery mode and defend mode, and he unpacks that in the book. They correspond to two different neural networks or neural systems, neuropsychological systems called the behavioral activation system and the behavioral inhibition system. Behavioral inhibition system referring to the defend mode. And he argues that spending too much time in defend mode creates chronic anxiety. People in defend mode are more prone to stress and emotional pain when they face adversity. Okay. There are two notes here that I also like to briefly touch on. One note is about community, the other note is about political action and activism. The first note was about community. Jonathan Haidt says that in the real world, communities have a high bar for entry and exit, that it takes more to get into a community. There's cost associated with it, and you cannot as easily and as smoothly leave a community in the real world. But in the virtual world, it's too easy. The bar is low. And you can also talk about that in terms of absence of rituals. There are no rituals for entry into an online community. Related to that is that the observation that in the real world, when you have the reality principle against you, prestige comes from some kind of mastery, some kind of excellence. But in the world of influencers, you don't need excellence to gain prestige. Now, the second note about political activism, Haidt observes that political activism in the real world, when you go out, when you do real world political action, that's associated with flourishing and positive mental health outcomes, but not so for virtual activism. What is virtual activism? Quickly, let's go through the rules, the foundational rules that Jonathan Haidt is proposing that we should implement to curb and control the negative impact of the phone-based childhood. Do not let childhood be completely phone-based. So he says, number one, no smartphone use before high school. Number two, no social media before age 16. So first one was no smartphone before age 14, no social media before 16. Number three, third rule, schools should be phone-free. Should use things like lockers to free up kids' attention during the school hours. Number four, more supervised play in the physical world. More play. I like the book. I already said that, but there are some dangers of the way he presents the material in the book. Some people might misread him, or maybe he wants to be read in that way. So, for example, look at this passage. He writes, the best parenting book that my wife and I read when our children were toddlers urged us to look for opportunities to frustrate our children every day by laying out and enforcing the contingencies of life. For example, if you want to watch Teletubbies, you must first put away your toys. If you persist in doing that, you will get time out. Persist in doing that, something. Yes, your sister got something you didn't, and that happens sometimes. End quote. So imagine somebody reading this and saying, okay, I want to frustrate my kids every day with some random thing. So there are dangers of misreading. The other thing that I don't, personally, this is a matter of taste, maybe more than taste. I don't like how these American public intellectuals, and also I include Jordan Peterson in that category of public quote-unquote intellectuals, really thick, emboldened quotation marks. These public intellectuals really play that card of doctor. In my job as a professor, I met some students who told me this. One student in my class sent me this email. Let me read this email from the insightful student because I'm a professor. Okay, so they get they want to get some persuasive power from that, which I don't think is a good idea, to have your reader suspend their disbelief, to suspend their critical judgment, their critical faculty as readers by keep referring to yourself as doctor or professor. I mean, I also have a PhD, but I don't like to play that card. I mean, there are many people. I got a PhD from University of Toronto, same place that Jordan Peterson was working. But I don't ask myself, I don't introduce myself, I don't ask other people, and I don't introduce myself as doctor. I don't require to be called. Because I don't like to include that as a piece on the board of presenting material in the public. That's one of the reasons why, if you compare Jonathan Haidt with Neil Postman doesn't do that. He just gives you his perspective. He relies on your rationality, and in doing that, he brings in his own rationality. The other thing that I already touched on is that this is a broader cultural problem with performance. You know, even public intellectuals are being influencers now, not just on social media, but also in their professional roles. There's a great book by Jerry Mueller called The Tyranny of Metrics, and that is a book that offers a broader cultural criticism. It's a criticism, and I feel like Jonathan Haidt's criticism is a much narrower version of that criticism. And because it is so narrow, it doesn't apply to himself and his role as a public intellectual. The other thing that I don't like about this way of treating the subject is that it lacks completely the tragic sense of life. That, you know, if you do this, your child will be happy. If you let your child play, they will be strong and healthy and they can go and do great things in the world. No, that's like, okay, your argument applies to the average child. You know, on average, the typical child, the average child will be more well adjusted if every child goes out there and takes risks. But those risks mean that some of those children are going to be sacrificed because those risks will actually lead to some negative consequence for them. But because those will be a minority of children, on average, it has a positive impact. But there is tragedy involved in that. Anything we do, there is tragedy in life. That tragic sense, that tragic sensibility. I know that I'm confounding that with Haidt's attention to the average. And because he's so concerned with averages and statistics, that's why he also has that very strong distinction between boys and girls. Boys are like this, girls are like this. Yeah, statistically. Some other sources that came to mind as I was reading this. Jonathan Haidt writes about rituals and the absence of rituals. There's a book by Byung-Chul, The Disappearance of Rituals. Worth reading. He talks about collective action. John Dewey has a book called Individualism, Old and New. It's a short book. And in that book, Dewey argues that we need a new understanding of individualism that's based on our interconnectedness and our capacity for collective action, collective initiative, and cooperation. Speaking of Dewey, there is also another book, Freedom and Culture. And in that book, Dewey talks about freedom being something that needs to be cultivated, the capacity for freedom. It doesn't come naturally. You can't just let kids be free. Freedom is something that is achieved through education and training. On tragedy, which I think Jonathan Haidt doesn't really embody a sense of tragedy, doesn't get the tragic sense of life. George Steiner has a book that I read about. I haven't read that book, but Death of Tragedy, it's called. I read a comment about it in Terry Eagleton's book. So Steiner, Eagleton, tragedy, or the tragic sense of life, can really be distinguished from or contrasted with the problem-solving attitude, that life only consists of a series of problems to be solved. You know, So Haidt, for example, he seems to argue that take risks and hopefully your kids will not be among those that will be harmed by the risk taking in the risk taking process. But they might be. That's tragic. Other general parenting books, The Drama of the Gifted Child, Hold On to Your Kids. On addiction, a book that I've discussed already on the channel, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And a good treatment of addiction always leads to a discussion of attachment. And Gabor Mate does that. That's it. Thank you so much for your attention. Thanks for staying with me until this point. If you like the video, do whatever you want to do. Just make sure that the notifications are off on your phone. Turn them off. And that's it. I'll talk to you next time.